Early voting begins Monday, and the Big Tuesday is 2 weeks and change away. Where stands Arkansas in the midterms? The state's highest court almost as controversial now as the issues before it. Under fire though it is, the court remains in business to the disappointment of business, among others. But first, an issue that remains on the ballot, and the votes will be counted. Both sides of the question, next on Arkansas Week.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for the broadcast. The candidates, the polls, the campaign spending. We'll get to that in a moment in our roundtable. But first, the Arkansas Supreme Court on Thursday effectively struck from the ballot a multifaceted proposal involving lawsuits, legal fees, and the court itself. But it let stand another question put to voters: whether the Arkansas minimum wage should be incrementally increased to $11 per hour by 2021. With us now, advocates for both sides. Kristen Foster manages the campaign in behalf of the minimum wage issue. Dr. Jeremy Horpedahl is a research scholar and assistant professor of economics at the University of Central Arkansas. Thanks very much to both of you for being with us for the program. Ms. Foster, we'll begin with you because your organization took the initiative. Why now? Why not let the marketplace do its work?
Well, it's a great question, and thank you so much for having us here to talk about this important issue that's going to impact so many Arkansas workers. You know, the cost of groceries, of daily living expenses have continued to go up over the years, and we have not seen wages keep up with that. And so this issue will go to voters in November for them to decide whether we think that we should raise the minimum wage. We think it's very important to implement this program so that people who are working full-time can afford to meet their basic needs, as well as, you know, feed their children and hopefully invest in themselves to improve their skills and do better in life.
Doctor, I suspect anyway that you would argue for the invisible hand.
Well, yes, thanks also for having me on. I think this is a really important issue. I think, though, that the important thing to remember about the $11 minimum wage in Arkansas is that because we have a low median wage here and a low cost of living, this is essentially the equivalent of a $15 minimum wage in a state like California or New York. So we're really going way outside of what any state has ever tried. Those states aren't even planning to have that high of a minimum wage for years in the future. So all the research on this already on minimum wage, there's lots of it by economists. This type of increase and this high, we've never seen it before. We don't know how large the effects will be on employment, on the cost of living, if we're talking about the cost of living going up. This is a 50% increase if we include the increase that started in 2015. Cumulative with this one, it would be a 50% increase in labor costs for businesses over just a 6-year time period. No state has ever tried anything like that before. So as an economist, that worries me that we're kind of in uncharted territory, almost a guinea pig in this experiment of what's going on with the minimum wage nationally.
Why doesn't the state play Lewis and Clark, for example? Let's explore that territory. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's a lot of potential downsides. So if unemployment goes up a lot, if workers don't get that first step on the job ladder, then they're not going to have all the skills we need. We've had 9 years of economic growth, pretty good economic growth. But we're going to have a recession coming up soon. If we're implementing the highest minimum wage ever right in the middle of a recession, that can cause very big hardships for a lot of workers and families in Arkansas.
Yeah, Ms. Foster.
You know, we've heard these same kind of arguments in 2014 when we were doing a similar initiative to raise the minimum wage in Arkansas. And since then, what we have seen is 70,000 new jobs added, and we've seen our unemployment rate go down. We also see these studies in states across the nation. We've had 29 states implement a minimum wage increase since 2009, and in all of those states, we've seen similar results where paychecks have gone up and unemployment has gone down.
Well, a frequent argument, as the doctor I think alluded to a moment ago, is that raising the minimum wage will effectively seal off or threaten jobs that the least skilled workers in the state need.
You know, we have seen some states where there has been less growth in kind of those starting jobs, but we've not seen that be something that's such a huge impact that it has prevented young workers from getting into the workplace in general. It's also important to remember that this initiative is not just going to be about young workers. Minimum wage workers come from all walks of life in Arkansas. This may be home health care workers, teachers' aides that are working in classrooms right now as we speak, who will be impacted by this. And as Dr. Horpedal alluded to, in Arkansas, the minimum wage right now only equals out to about $18,000 a year. So that may sound like we've been adding to it and doing increases over the last couple of years, but workers are still at such a low wage that they just cannot make ends meet without relying on assistance.
Both of you, I would ask to reflect on this. Just moments before we began this broadcast, the State Employment Division reported that the jobless rate in Arkansas had fallen to a new record low. Prism this issue through that, beginning with you, Doc.
Yeah, absolutely. So while we do have a very low unemployment rate in Arkansas, the employment rate, if you look at number of people employed as a percentage of the population, we have the 6th lowest employment rate. So the unemployment rate only includes people who are looking for jobs. If you include everyone, we have a very low employment rate. Also, if we talk about the job growth in the past few years, yes, we've had job growth, but the entire national economy is expanding. Arkansas's job growth is actually less than the national average since 2015, when we implemented the last minimum wage. It's been about 4%. Nationally, it's at 6%. And a lot of other of our similar states like Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, they've all seen job growth that's been twice the rate in Arkansas. So yes, we've added jobs, but at a much slower rate than the rest of the country and our competitor states.
All right, Ms. Foster.
I'm not an economist. I cannot throw out lots of different numbers and statistics on things like that. However, I can say that we have looked at research across the country on this issue, and economists, generally we've seen most agree with the fact that implementing an increased minimum wage does have a positive impact on workers and on employers.
We have heard the argument before, in fact, Doc, that an mandated increase in the minimum wage would wreak havoc with the Arkansas economy. It would not seem to have done that. Or your view?
Yeah, it's not going to wreak havoc on the entire economy because so far our increases in the minimum wage have applied to a very small part of the labor force. This one's going to affect 30% of the Arkansas workforce. Now, the proponents tout that as a benefit, 30% will get a raise. I look at it as 30% will be affected, and we don't know because no state has tried a minimum wage that affects 30% of the labor force, that increases labor costs this quickly, this fast. And while some economists would say small increases in the minimum wage cause minimal effects, even the economists such as Aaron Dubé, who's at UMass Amherst, who's one of the leading proponents of increasing minimum wage, he says once you get above about 50 or 60% of your median wage, we don't know what happens. There's no research on it. This is going to put our median wage at above 70% of the median wage. And so all the old research kind of goes out the window, and we're really in uncharted territory. And if voters want to try that, be the Lewis and Clark, that's of course in Arkansas the people rule, but that we need to know that a lot of that research is relevant to only very small increases in the minimum wage.
Ms. Foster, you don't mind exploring, I would gather.
No, not at all. We have seen other states that have implemented very similar increases, so I would disagree that this is brand new territory. There are several other states that have very similar increases in the works right now that will be implemented over the same time period that we are. So by the time this is fully implemented in 2021, we will see many states around the country being at a very similar wage.
Actually, Arkansas will have the highest minimum wage in the country as a percent of its median income. Median wage in 2021, higher even than California or Massachusetts.
Is that necessarily a bad thing, though, Doc?
If there are no unemployment effects and there are no effects on the cost of living, which she and others suggested, then that would be great. But a lot of economic research suggests that that's not the case, that there are effects not only on employment, on cost of living, that employers are less likely to offer fringe benefits like health care. So there could be lots of other effects here that we'd be seeing that are bad and hard to reverse, especially in a recession.
Many of the studies that we have seen like that tend to focus on areas that have been really rapid increases to a very high wage over a short period of time, which is why Arkansas is not looking at implementing that type of increase. We are looking at doing this spread out as a gradual increase to avoid some of those issues. And even on some of the reports that have come out as showing a negative impact, those researchers are coming back now years later and saying that their information was not correct. There's a study coming out on Monday from a researcher who put out a negative report in Seattle and is planning to bring out a report on Monday saying that his research really wasn't that accurate at that time because he didn't have enough information over a long enough span of time. So we're kind of seeing that a lot of that is coming back and saying, you know, we really didn't have full information at the time when we did this.
Ms. Foster began. A few seconds remaining. Doctor, I'll give you the closing word.
Yeah, I think we do really need to think about if we want to go into this uncharted territory. If we want to kind of be the guinea pig where economists are going to come to Arkansas and say, let's study, see what's going on here, see if there really are negative effects or if everything's rosy. I think that the polling indicates this is going to pass, so you have a very good advantage here. But this is not just a small increase, I would say. It's a large increase. It's a 30% increase over 3 years. That's a 10% increase. That's not small. Cost of living tends to go up 2 or 3% a year. I would say this is big.
Dr. Horpedahl, Ms. Foster, thank you very much for your time. We're out of hours anyway.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being on the program. And we'll be right back with a roundtable. Back with tonight's posse, which includes Heather Yates from the political science staff at UCA, Hoyt Purvis, an independent journalist, and Michael Hiblin is news director at KUAR Public Radio for Central Arkansas. Michael, we'll start with you. A very busy week at and involving the Arkansas Supreme Court, but probably at the top. Yesterday, the justices struck down one of the hottest issues that would have appeared anyway on the Tuesday ballot, and that's issue 1.
Yeah, the tort reform proposal. Basically, the High Court agreed with the lower court ruling by Pulaski County Circuit Judge Mackie Pierce that this inappropriately or unconstitutionally included 4 separate issues in one amendment here. This was referred by the legislature, would have put a cap on damages in civil lawsuits, limited fees for attorneys, also would have given the legislature more control over court proceedings. But basically this appeal from Randy Zook, head of the State Chamber of Commerce, was rejected and the lower court decision upheld.
Yeah, this was an expensive proposal. A lot of money had already been spent on this.
Exactly.
And more would have been spent.
A huge amount of money, but at the same time, it's not really that surprising, given past history, that this has been kicked off the ballot, this issue. But it generated a lot of activity and a lot of campaign spending in the meantime.
It has also generated some, you want to call them threats, but pledges of retribution, frankly, from some members of the General Assembly who, this was a GA-referred initiative.
Yeah, the suggestion that, well, we're about to take up funding here this coming week, I think, and that, yeah, pretty much the threat, well, we're going to perhaps cut some of your funding. Very direct response to this.
Well, the court itself is the subject of or the object is involved, and it's controversial. I'm stumbling out of style this. But the court itself is probably the most controversial element of government, component of government right now.
And that's oftentimes what happens too when you have elected judges as well. When they're not appointed and elected, it introduces a whole new political component to it as well. And I think this is something that Arkansas has drawn a lot of attention about with regard to judicial elections, money being involved in judicial elections, and with issue 1, you know, the power struggle between the GOP trifecta in the state and how the court is sometimes interjecting itself, and sometimes, in this case, how the state legislature is also trying to consolidate its influence over the judiciary. Yeah,
we have the issues of the court itself, in addition to the issues about what's going to be on the ballot, et cetera. I mean, you really, it's you know, the old saying, you can't tell the players without a scorecard. And on this one, you have a shifting cast of characters, and Of course, we got Judge Griffin and all the back and forth about ethics and what's involved there. And then you have the court making rulings about what can or can't be on the ballot. I think, to say the least, it's going to make voters a little dizzy.
Well, yeah, and the governor's in the position, he's going to have to appoint, we'll have a new team in effect. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, with 5 justices who filed this appeal regarding the Judge Griffin decision. This was the statement that came out Wednesday afternoon, about 5 o'clock, very end of day, just by these 5 justices challenging the decision by the Arkansas Judicial Discipline and Disability Commission, and apparently, essentially saying that the commission is without jurisdiction to file charges against the state Supreme Court. And again, this all goes back to Judge Griffin. On the same day he made a ruling that would have stopped an execution, also then taking part in a protest outside the governor's mansion, laying down on a cot, mimicking an inmate strapped to a gurney. And this has just gone back and forth now. It's been a year and a half since that happened, and the High Court then stripped him of the ability to hear any execution-related cases. Well, the response on Thursday from a judge or an attorney representing Judge Griffin called this a desperate attempt to avoid accountability, said the order banning Griffin from death penalty cases for perpetuity was obviously a disciplinary measure, and it prompts the question, are there no limits to the High Court's authority? Is it omnipotent?
Well, and to go back to the ballot issue and the role of the Supreme Court there, I mean, you've got casinos, as far as I know, are still on the ballot.
Yeah,
the casino and the minimum wage. We just heard about that. So, you know, that given past history, it's in some ways surprising that even a couple of them are still alive at this point.
yeah, let's go to the midterms. Heather, you've been looking at all of it, putting it in this funnel. What's come out at the bottom? What's the thing that
to try to sum this up in the few minutes that we have, but taking a look at what's happening nationally and where Arkansas fits into this. Nationally, there is a great deal of enthusiasm being generated for the midterms in very specific contexts. In Arkansas, what we are seeing is an enthusiasm gap, and what that means is it doesn't mean that there's the lack of enthusiasm, but what we're seeing on par with in comparison to national trends. Arkansas is a safe Republican state. Arkansas still loves Trump. Arkansas has a 10-point lead over national average in terms of job approval for Trump. Also, the congressional races in Arkansas are relatively safe. The Arkansas district, the 2nd congressional district, was the district that caught most of attention early on in April. But what we saw with the fall polling is that the point spread between Clark Tucker and French Hill expanded from a 5-point gap to a 9-point gap, and so that's enough to dampen some of that enthusiasm that's happening here in Arkansas. What we're also seeing too is that there's a lack of polling in the Arkansas 2nd district. So that's also telling us a couple of things. One, we're not getting the real-time live updates about any movement on that. Also, it's telling us about what the overall interest in the race is. Now, with that being said, we're also taking a look at the fundraising. Clark Tucker was able to outraise French Hill, but he also has less cash on hand. So that means that French Hill's incumbency status and his incumbency advantage is forcing Clark Tucker to spend that cash. How that's going to turn out, we'll know in 3 weeks. But in terms of the Arkansas 2nd district, that's probably the one district nationally that some watchers are going to look at, but it's not generating the same type of enthusiasm that I think that the DCCC or the establishment had hoped early in the spring. And with regard to voter registration, it's just my own casual survey of districts and county clerk's offices around the state is that it's really an unremarkable year for voter registration. Voter registration is actually down in some counties from 2014. So I think that's also interesting to take note, which is what persuades me to come to the conclusion that there's an enthusiasm gap here in Arkansas. And it's largely because Arkansas is Trump country, it's crimson Trump country. There's a lot of enthusiasm still for the president. The president's job approval just improved 3 points this past couple of weeks. So that's all playing out into what's heading into the midterms here in Arkansas.
Yeah, what, you see any purple out there anyway?
Well, a couple of things. One is that it's interesting that the numbers in Arkansas are not that different than what we're seeing in the Senate race in Texas between O'Rourke and Cruz. So that's, that can change certainly, but as of now, the one other point I would make is women. Indications are that there's a lot more activity and interest in women, certainly in Northwest Arkansas, and I think the numbers there would reflect it. There's one of the legislative races, which involves the incumbent Charlie Collins against Denise Garner, the Democrat challenger. What's interesting is how much money, how much TV money, how much that is being seen in a legislative campaign. You don't usually see ads, TV ads, saturation TV for legislative candidates. And what's also interesting is that Garner, the Democrat, has not engaged in any attack ads at all, at least anything that I've seen or know about. Now, we have some other advertising things in the state that are somewhat different from that, but those are a couple of things I think to take note of.
Michael, there's a lot of dark money coming in.
Yeah, and especially so in the race for the Supreme Court seat held by Courtney Goodson. A lot of money coming in that backs David Sterling, and there's some question about where that's coming from. The group funding this says, well, this isn't dark money. We, report to the IRS, but it's still not saying the sources within Arkansas. And he's running a very overtly partisan race here, even ads tying him to Trump, suggesting he would be a justice who supports the Trump agenda, essentially. And that's unusual for a Supreme Court race.
Heather?
And when we're also talking about dark money too, that we want to clarify that even though these groups do disclose the money that they have on hand and that they've taken into the IRS, what the namesake for is that these groups don't have to disclose who their donors are. And so that's the very key piece, is that these organizations, yes, donate this money, they disclose that, but who is contributing that contribution to this third-party organization? And that's what makes political watchers nervous, and that's what's in terms of just who is fronting and supporting the campaign messaging through these third-party actors. And so that's something also to remind our viewing audiences, like where the term dark money gets it's not necessarily conspiratorial and nefarious in that sense. It's just that the actual contributors and the number of contributors, you can have a 527 group or a super PAC that has 3 donors. And that is the one thing that we don't know. We don't know how deep these pockets are, and we don't know how many contributors there are. So it could be 1 person, it could be 27 people, and that's the nebulous aspect to this, and that's what conceals that. And I just want to add one other point about the role of women in the midterm of this election, because Arkansas is a standout state in terms that there are 45 women running for statewide offices all the way down to state legislatures. And with you're exactly right, with the type of not type of money, but in addition to the amount of money coming in to state legislative races from organizations like the CAWP is quite remarkable, and that does yield to have some implications for policymaking in this state. If just a handful of women in Arkansas get elected to the Senate, that increases the proportionality of women's representation at the table, and so that is something that we should look at. I think it's only going to take maybe 4 seats in the Arkansas Senate to really change the dynamic of policymaking there. So that's absolutely correct in terms of what we're looking at, the dynamics of candidates. And there's also, when we're talking about the enthusiasm gap too, I think we also want to make sure that in Arkansas, that enthusiasm for gendered candidates may look differently than what it means nationally. I think there's these broad assumptions made that women tend to lean Democratic, but we have a lot of conservative women on the ballot as well too. And so we also want to tease that out, and those fine nuances are really important, but those are definitely races that I'm taking a look at heading into.
Yeah, I was going to ask, it may involve may alter the gender balance anyway in the Senate, but not, or in the legislature, but not necessarily the ideological leaning
Right,
to that.
exactly, yeah, because we're seeing the increase of women, but they're not all Democratic women, that we have an increase of conservative women as well on the ballots, and and that conversation is happening a lot behind the scenes in election analysis, is that dispelling some of these myths about what a female candidate on the ballot means, is that it doesn't mean what it used to mean in the year 2002 or 2006. There are very conservative Republican women on the ballots. We saw that in the governor's race with Jan
Already
Morgan.
on the General Assembly. Yeah,
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so that's also something to keep on the horizon. But there is a lot of movement there that is significant.
That reminds me, I should have mentioned earlier that Representative Collins is particularly identified as the champion of the concealed carry on campuses, and that the gun issue, while it's certainly not a winning issue necessarily, is a motivating issue for certainly on the female side, I think.
Yeah, 30 seconds, Michael.
Early voting begins Monday, and we nationally, it's been forecast that we could see the biggest turnout for a midterm election in 50 years. Now, in Arkansas, we don't know if that's the case, Heather, partly from what you said, but also we talked with the Pulaski County Elections Office, and they said they're not necessarily seeing any spike in voter registration. Their estimate is that this probably be about most midterm elections.
Yeah, got into there. We're out of time. Thanks to everybody for coming in. As always, thanks to you for watching. See you next week.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.